What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of this week's episode, where we're going to dive into some of my tried and true go-to therapy tools. I just find myself utilizing them over and over again, regardless of my treatment plan for a particular client, and even regardless of my general therapy approach with that client. I always find it fun and informative to hear what other people's go-to tools are. So this isn't prescriptive. If you're not using any of these tools at all, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. I just thought it might be interesting to share. And I'd also love to hear from you all what your go-to approaches are in the comments if you'd like to share. Now, as sort of a preface before I share all of these tools that I tend to go to, I thought I might say a little bit about my general therapy approach overall. Now, I am a pretty eclectic therapist. I love that I have the freedom to tailor my approach to each individual client's needs, and I pull from a lot of different evidence-based theories when I make a treatment plan with a client. However, even though I pull from a lot of different approaches in my interventions and my treatment plans with my clients, I do almost universally operate from an ACT framework as far as like the lenses that I'm using to look at my clients and their presenting issues. I won't do a deep dive in ACT today, but it stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Basically, regardless of what tools I'm using to treat a client and their presenting issues, I tend to almost always be asking the questions like, who is this client? What are their strongest values and beliefs? And how can I support them in living a life that best aligns with who they are, their values, and their beliefs? That said, there are just certain techniques that I can sprinkle into pretty much any session that just stick. They work for me, so I use them all the time. So we're gonna share some of my top tools that I go to over and over again in today's episode. When I was preparing for this episode and trying to think which tool I use the most above and beyond any other therapeutic tool, I was kind of surprised to reflect and realize that probably my most utilized therapeutic tool is psychoeducation. I know, at least for me, I always had this picture in my training years of psychoeducation as like this boring lecture, like I'm just using intellectualized language to explain something very complicated to my client, rather than, being there with them and supporting them in whatever they're needing. However, there are certain bits of statistics and research that I find myself pointing to over and over again, because culturally there are a lot of values in place that don't really align with the evidence that we have available in the research. And so there's a lot of scenarios where I'll see clients living their life in a way that generally best aligns with not only their values, but best aligns with the research we have available in that particular topic, but they're feeling like they're falling short because maybe culturally they're living their life differently than, the people in their communities are, their families, things like that. Or maybe they've been really pushing or striving to live their lives in a way that aligns with kind of cultural norms and values, but they're experiencing that tension and cognitive dissonance because it's not how they really want to live. And yeah, those cultural values may not necessarily align with the evidence either. So to me, whenever this comes up with clients, it feels like one of those therapeutic slow pitches where I can just cite some available statistics regarding what this client is concerned about that immediately can put them at ease. And it doesn't end up being a giant lecture, typically. Usually just a few sentences can accomplish this goal quickly. A lot of the examples that I pull from are about interpersonal relationships. So whether it's about couples work or parenting or social skills in your community. One example that I go to a lot is parents who are feeling like they are falling short as far as, being the perfect best parent for their child. And in these scenarios, I will often cite research about good enough parenting. It might sound something like this. It's so common in our culture to be heavily concerned about making everything just right for our kids in order to be the best parents, of course. But research suggests that pacing our parenting approach with our own needs allows developing children to learn independence and self-soothing at a pace that fits both what the parent needs and the child. So that moment where you spend a few extra minutes just lying down before getting up to help your child is not only a reflection of your humanness, but it plays an essential role in helping your child learn to self-soothe, that they can handle tough things, and that you're always going to be there even if you're not there immediately. You'll be there eventually. This is one of those areas where our broader culture around parenting, at least in a lot of my circles and the circles that my clients are in, has overcompensated so much from our past mistakes that we've found ourselves leaning too far into a value of being the ultimate, most perfect parent ever, forsaking our own needs for the sake of like being the best for our kids, which of course at face value sounds great. But the evidence has consistently shown that when we prioritize taking care of our needs as a parent and as a person, our children also ultimately benefit from that, right? If they need to be able to develop a sense of independence, self-soothing, mom or dad or caregiver is always going to come back even if they're unavailable for a bit. And those are skills that children need to learn, and they naturally will build them as they develop as their caregivers focus on taking care of themselves as well, of course, within appropriate reason. I see this happen all the time. For some reason, I just had a bunch of clients have babies on my caseload or pregnant. Like half my clients have had babies within the last year. It's kind of wild. So especially in that kind of early phase, particularly for moms, I've noticed just this insane amount of pressure to show up for our children in a way that is unsustainable, impossible to take care of yourself as a mom, and ultimately isn't what's best for our children, generally, statistically speaking. So it always feels really good for me to deliver this information about good enough parenting. And for most of my clients, they're just like immediately soothed. It's like the stars align for them internally and they go, oh, that makes so much sense. I'm so glad. But it's not just parents or expecting moms that psychoeducation applies to. I end up citing similar kinds of statistics frequently for clients, especially in their interpersonal relationships, where we often have some of that mismatch of like how I'm living my life doesn't seem to align with what's culturally valued. And so is there something wrong there? And often the answer is actually like maybe we can call into question some of these cultural values because they might not line up with the research. Not that our only goal in life is to do things that fully always align with statistics, because statistics are averages and there needs to be room for outliers and all that, but this can be a helpful tool often. Also, if the lighting is distracting you today, it is partly cloudy outside, which is lovely to look at through the window, but I'm aware that the lighting just keeps changing and such is life. Okay, we're gonna get through it. Okay, the rest of these aren't in any particular order of like how often I use them. They're just all things I tend to use every single day I see clients. And the next tool I find myself turning to often is IFS parts work. Now, of course, IFS, or internal family systems, has a formalized, structured approach for how to engage with this parts work for clients. And typically, that's not what I'm usually implementing in most of my sessions. However, just the parts language itself can be incredibly useful in beginning to shift how a client sees their situation, how they deal with their situation. The general concept of IFS is, we have all these different parts of ourselves that at times might be sort of butting heads rather than working together to move forward as a unit. And so in IFS therapy, you're effectively doing a sort of family therapy on all these different kind of minions in our mind and helping them get along so that they can work together. I find it incredibly useful to use this kind of language, especially when clients are feeling stuck on a decision, and particularly if this kind of indecisive experience is something they're starting to see as more of an identifier, like I'm an indecisive person, or why can't I figure this out? I'll start to use parts language. It might sound something like this. I don't know, I can't seem to make up my mind. I mean, sometimes I think I want to climb up the ladder at work, but then other times I just feel tired and I'd rather just stay where I'm at. So you see, Doc, like that's my problem. Like, how am I supposed to know what to do if I can't even know what I want? I guess I'll just always be indecisive, right? Isn't that my issue? In moments like this, I find generally that gently bringing up parts language can really help shift the way a client sees their situation as multifaceted and nuanced, that they are a person with more than one set of values. And it may be that two very important values or beliefs or parts of them have something important to say and contribute to a decision rather than them just being indecisive. So I might say something like this. If you don't mind me chiming in for a second, I noticed you're using language that makes it sound like there's maybe something wrong about the fact that you're not sure what you want. When this happens, I find it much more helpful to refer to the parts of ourselves that want different things. So there might be a part of you, for example, that values climbing up the ladder in your career, while there might also be a part of you that values something like finding comfort and staying where you're at. It's totally normal to have these kind of different, seemingly competing values like this. And when this happens, I find it can be helpful to take some time to get to know each of these parts, see what each of them really wants, and see if the two or more can come together to make a decision in a way that respects and acknowledges all the preferences and desires you have. Sometimes just that alone is enough for a client to unlock a different approach, and they can kind of keep the ball rolling from there. Or if they're still feeling really stuck because maybe these sort of two parts or multiple parts are constantly interrupting each other, then I'll typically invite clients to let one part sort of take the stage at a time. Let that part of them say their full piece. They have the microphone, they have the floor, and they're going to say everything that's on their mind about this decision or this thing that they're stuck on, all the pros, all the cons, according to that part of them. And once that part is completely finished, then they can pass the microphone on to another part of them who can fully say everything. And oftentimes, clients haven't even gotten a chance to hear what each part of them would have to say fully because there's just like an argument between the two and they never have really listened to each other. So just letting each of them air it all out without interruption can sometimes be enough. Or we can start to see where the arguments are happening and address those in a more targeted way. Before we dive into the rest of my go-to therapy tools, I'd like to thank Powbox for sponsoring today's episode. When I first learned that signing a BAA with Google Workspace alone wasn't enough to ensure that your client emails were HIPAA secure, I signed up for Powbox. It's been a little over a year since then, and it's so simple to use, I almost forget that it's even there. It's like my own little personal elf working behind the scenes encrypting all my emails. Rather than require your clients to log into a portal or enter a password in order to securely receive messages from you, you can just message each other straight from your regular email inbox. Powbox integrates on the back end of your email provider and is completely invisible except for the Secured by Powbox badge at the bottom of your emails. Just follow a few simple steps to get it set up, and if you need help, Powbox's customer support consistently receives amazing reviews. If you'd like to check out Powbox, they offer a 14-day free trial to all users, and for the first 100 people who mention my name at sign up, you'll get an extra $250 off your first year. Just head to powbox.com and enter Marie Fang in the box that asks how you heard about them. That's Powbox spelled Paubox.com. Thank you again to Powbox for sponsoring this episode, and now on to my next most utilized tool in therapy. Another favorite tool of mine that I go to at least daily on a client day is radical acceptance. Now, this concept has many names depending on kind of what theoretical orientation hat you're wearing, but I like this phrasing as described in DBT because it seems to sort of on the surface most clearly capture what it is. Like, you have to radically accept the things that you can't change. A lot of our life circumstances are changeable, like we can do something to influence the things that are happening around us, but there's also a lot of things that we genuinely cannot change, not within reason or maybe not at all. And I think culturally, we tend to have more of a mindset of like, if something's not working for you, you can probably change the situation, which is true a lot of the times, but I think sometimes we can forget to also address that like some things are just not in our control. The serenity prayer also captures this concept well, which goes, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Some clients find the serenity prayer helpful. Other clients will find it helpful to just reference the phrase, it is what it is. Some people hate that phrase, but some version of this is incredibly useful in therapy. I find myself turning to this when it seems like clients are just continuously fighting a circumstance that they can't change, or they might not be able to change, or they've done the extent of what they're able to influence themselves and the rest is beyond what they can do. Then I'll reference radical acceptance. I don't typically say, we're going to practice radical acceptance now, but I'll find different ways, depending on what the client seems like they might benefit from, to frame that I'm noticing that they keep fighting and it's not seeming to work for them. And I have so much empathy for this experience because I can fall prey. I think we all do, right? I don't know. I can fall prey to this all the time. Like, if something is not going my way, just try harder to make it go more my way. And if you can't hold that narrative for a while, it feels empowering because then it tells us that the world can be in our control. We just have to, pull the right levers to make it go our way. However, when we acknowledge that there's things that aren't in our control, that is definitely a more uncomfortable space to hang out. And for a lot of clients, if they really can notice that there's things that are out of their control in a situation that they've been fighting, there tends to be grief that's underlying that. Like, wow, there's nothing else I could do here, and it sucks. I don't like it. And okay, then we're gonna have to work on the grief rather than putting all our energy into fighting, swimming upstream on something that you're never gonna win. As I mentioned, depending on the client, I have different ways that I'll broach radical acceptance so that I'm not saying like, you just need to radically accept the situation that you're in. Most of the time, I'll take a sort of curious approach, and it might sound something like this. I've seen you work so hard for so long trying to change this circumstance, and also just how exhausted you are, understandably. And I guess a genuine wondering that's coming up for me is, like, how possible is it really for you to change this circumstance? I'm just a little worried that you might keep working yourself into the ground with little or no fruit to show from it. What do you think? My next go-to approach, I made up the term for it, and that's I'm a curious 5-year-old. Now, there's other terms that are more formal therapeutic terms for this. I mean, you could potentially refer to this approach as like Socratic questioning. However, when I look up resources on Socratic questioning, it still has more of like an adult framework to it. And I like the idea of putting on my curious 5-year-old hat when I'm taking this approach with a client. The reason why I call it the curious 5-year-old approach is like when my clients just seem like they keep getting stuck and looping around on things, I like to ask questions that live in the realm of like, why is the sky blue? Like stuff that your 5-year-old will ask, or my 5-year-old will ask me, where it's like this obvious assumption on the one hand, but then when I go to answer their question, I'm like, oh, that's a great question. And then it's sort of like there's all these assumptions that we have that if we just kind of click on our curious 5-year-old hat, we might go, actually, I don't really know where that assumption comes from. Like maybe let's take a minute to get to know it a little bit better. And if I kind of try to embody a 5-year-old, it allows me to present my curiosity in a way that hopefully doesn't come across as judgmental, but is this genuine kind of invitation to explore, to say, I'm really wondering about that. Like, where did that come from? What do you think that is? And to just explore together rather than being like, where did that assumption come from? So here's an example of how that might play out. The client says, yeah, but I could never tell my husband how I actually feel about that, obviously. And then I might say something like, that's interesting. I'm curious about that. I think it could be really helpful to map out all the reasons why you think you can't tell your husband how you feel. Would you be willing to say a little more about why you can't tell him? And then a lot of times the client might respond with something like, yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, I don't think I've ever asked that question before, so let me think about that for a sec. And then you can just keep following that gentle line of curious questioning until your client identifies any potential snags in their thinking or their approach. When I use this approach, a lot of times my clients don't seem to need any spoon feeding. They can just genuinely find themselves some snag in like the way that they're thinking that doesn't align with their actual beliefs or values or how they see the world. And the last go-to tool that I'll share, at least for today's episode, is what I call following a line of thinking to its bitter end. I think some people might refer to this as worst case scenario therapy. It's essentially the opposite of what CBT attempts to do with catastrophic thinking, where CBT will do more of a reality check and say like, okay, you have this worst case scenario in your mind that you're afraid of. How likely is that worst case scenario going to actually play out? And, a lot of times it's really unlikely or, probably not going to happen. And so that's where the soothing comes from. It's like whatever the worst case scenario is, it's probably not going to happen, so we can feel better now. And I think reality checks have their place to a degree. It's good to keep a sense of like how likely is something going to go bad kind of in our minds, so we're not always thinking the worst case scenario is hanging out around the corner at all times. But there's a limit to how far that CBT approach can go, because sometimes the worst case scenario absolutely happens. Many times things happen that are much worse than we ever imagined, unfortunately. And so it's also really important to name what some of those feared worst case scenarios are that our clients have in mind, and then ask the question like, how can we make sure that you're okay even if the worst case scenario happens? Sometimes there's like actual practical planning that make people feel more comfortable. But a lot of times this is about helping people learn that if they're going to go through something really uncomfortable, even if it's quite horrible, that they still have the resources to be okay. If we exclusively were to rely on the CBT approach of reality checking, catastrophic thinking, then it doesn't address like how to equip your client for like just in case the worst case scenario does happen. Like, are we communicating to them then that they wouldn't be able to handle that? Now, this is kind of a delicate thing, because if somebody is prone to on the regular catastrophic thinking and they're living their life in this like the worst case scenario is around the corner at any given moment, like this is probably not the first intervention to lean into. However, I notice for a lot of my clients, they'll name a fear that's sort of a fleeting fear passing through their mind. And then they'll sort of cut themselves off and say, well, you know what, that's probably not really likely going to happen anyway. I think I'm just catastrophizing. And not really finish the thought that we know is taking up real estate in their brain. So I'd rather just say, whoa, the thing is already living rent-free in your brain. Can we just take a little closer look at it? What's going on with that worst case scenario in your mind? Can we just reflect on what would happen? How would you handle that situation if the worst case scenario actually played out? Because a lot of times I think what people can do is they cut off their thought and say, oh, I'm probably just overthinking it, overreacting. It's probably not going to happen. And use that as a way to cope with having to face the actual fear of like, what if I'm not going to be able to cope with that worst case scenario in the off chance that it happens? So I really want my clients to learn that they sure can cope with that situation. And it's helpful to see that in advance of it actually playing out, so they don't have to carry that fear with them at all times. And I find myself leaning into this, especially if clients are bringing up worst case scenario fears that statistically are not that unlikely. That was a lot of double negatives, but here's an example. If a client says something like, sometimes I'm afraid that he'll just end up resenting me and I don't know, we get divorced, but I know I'm just catastrophizing because that's not actually going to happen. So I don't think I need to worry about that. Now, of course, we know statistically just about half of marriages end in divorce. And that may not be the case for this client. Maybe they have a whole bunch of protective factors, and so maybe their chances aren't 50%. But as a therapist, keeping these statistics in mind, like this isn't necessarily a worst case scenario. This is an outcome that's happening for folks on the regular. Or another example of something a client might say is, I'm so worried about this job interview because I'm just scared I'm not going to get the job. But I think I'm just psyching myself out because I'm such a good candidate. Like I'm probably going to get it. So there's no need to worry about that. And when they say that, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, but this job market is really tough. Like I don't even know how many other people are applying for this one spot at that job. Like statistically, their chances might be quite high that they don't get that job offer. And of course, as the therapist, generally, it's not helpful to say those things out loud. Like if I came back to my clients and I was like, yeah, there's a 50-50 chance that your marriage might end in divorce. Or like, yeah, there's probably 20 people applying for that one slot. Like there's only a 1 in 20 chance that you're going to get that job. Like that's not helpful, even if it is fully accurate. And so it's more helpful to follow up and follow the worst case scenario to its bitter end. So instead, I like to say something that sounds more like this. Okay, wait, just so we know what we're dealing with here, because we know this fear is already taking up space in your brain anyway. Where does that fear lead? Like, what's the worst case scenario there? And ultimately, this approach loops back onto radical acceptance, right? There's going to be some things we can't change. Like you could do your best efforts in that job interview and still not get the job. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong, but then we will have to learn to radically accept that that's how that situation played out. For me, rather than trying to teach clients like, you'll be okay because the worst case scenario is probably not going to happen to you, I'm much more interested in teaching clients that like, hey, sometimes really bad things are going to happen to you, unfortunately. And I want you to know that you can handle that situation. You are going to be okay. So I think that's something that we can offer particularly in this sort of cultural moment as therapists, where at least in the US, what I'm observing is kind of a general sense of like, if I work really hard and I do all the things the right way, then generally things will go my way. I won't have these worst case scenarios happen. And that's just statistically not true. That just everyone goes through hard things at some time. Like that's real life. And so I think there's probably a gap that we can sort of stand in as therapists to help bridge clients from crossing over this sort of untrue general cultural approach that like things will go your way if you do things right, and help clients see a more realistic picture of how the world works and realize that they can have tools to handle it. If they don't have them yet, we can build those up. I could definitely ramble on this concept for a long time because I think societally we're really emotionally unequipped to deal with hard things. I mean, I'm not saying news there, but because we're so concerned about making sure hard things don't happen to us, we really don't have tools to deal with them when they come. And so not only are we ill-equipped for when we go through hardship, but also generally folks can be really, really unwilling to step out and do something that feels uncomfortable, even if it's for the sake of leaning into something positive, offering something good into the world, offering something good for your loved ones. Like we're so concerned with our comfort and avoidance of hardship that we just have no tools at all for doing hard things. Like it's not just that bad things happen to us and we need to know how to cope, but also doing hard things is a necessary part of moving forward and leaning into good and progress. Says Marie, is that a hot take? I don't know. But I do see it as part of my role as a therapist to help clients know that they can be securely attached to themselves enough to know that they will be okay if hard things happen. Of course, this is not at all an exhaustive list of all my therapy techniques that I use. In fact, these are kind of almost just like those little like sidebar techniques that I use to supplement the main show of whatever I'm working on, but I use them often. I use pretty much all of these techniques every day when I'm seeing therapy clients, and so I thought it might be fun to share them with you all. I wonder what your thoughts are. Do you use any of these? Are there ones that you love to use that I didn't mention because I would love to learn from you as well? Let me know. And I hope this kind of just gets your brain juices flowing. And if you don't like some of my techniques or approaches, that's okay too. Well, this was kind of a fun, lighthearted episode. After last week's, I have not even looked at the comments from last week as a form of self-care, but I will look at them after I film this. I just wanted to film this, and then I will look. And if you missed last week's episode, I talked about how the election is affecting therapists. I think if you venture into that realm, you definitely know it's going to stir the pot, even if you're not trying to stir the pot. I wanted to do something a little lighthearted, less polarizing, hopefully this week, and I hope you found it supportive. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.